Okay, the next malacha that we're going to learn is what's called tefer. Tefer is sewing things together on Shabbos. Where do we find that they sewed in the Mishkan? So many times the curtains, of the Mishkan were sometimes torn and they needed to sew them. So there's two similar malachas. One is tying and one is sewing. Now tying is also you're putting two things together. Sewing is also you're combining two things together. But what's the difference between sewing and tying? Tying is when you take two things and you tie them together, they still remain two separate things. I tie this to this, so it's two separate things that you just tie together. When you sew two things together, they actually become one. So sewing in a certain respect is a little bit stricter than tying. For instance, we're going to learn more about tying in the next malacha, but tying, a temporary tying, is not forbidden on Shabbos. Like for instance, again, the details of tying we're going to learn, but very briefly. Let's say you make a tie on Shabbos. Okay, if you know how to do it, you tie your tie on Shabbos. That's not called a knot, making a knot, even though technically it's a knot. Why isn't it a knot? Because number one, you could take it out with one hand very easily. You're not making a knot that it should last more than one day. According to halacha, there's a machlekes, if it's 7 days makes a permanent knot, or 1 day make more than 24 hours makes a permanent knot. So a permanent knot is forbidden on Shabbos. Because over there in the Mishkan, they made permanent knots. But the temporary knot is not forbidden. You're allowed to tie your shoes on Shabbos. Why are you allowed to? Not with a double knot, but you could tie your shoes with a single, knot and a bow on top of it. You can't double the knot. Why? Because that's a permanent knot. So, but tying normally, why are you allowed to tie shoes on Shabbos? Or why are you allowed to tie a package on Shabbos? Whatever the tying is, because it's temporary. It's not like there for lasting long. Velcro is also not so. We'll get into all those things. But what about temporary sewing? Temporary sewing is a machlekes in poskim if a temporary sewing is biblically forbidden or not, or if it's permitted or not. So there's a lot of different opinions. In Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe holds that even though he brings down the machlekes, he writes that there are people that are lenient, v'chein ikar, and that's the primary halacha, that a temporary sewing, again, but you have to know what a temporary sewing means. So any sewing which is basically going to put two things together is, for instance, if it's going to be lasting more than a day, according to many opinions, it's a permanent sewing. If it's there, other opinions say a week. So again, the various opinions, what is called permanent. But now what happens, I'll give you an example. Sometimes you have a loose button. And when you pull the thread, it tightens it. Okay? That is not allowed on Shabbat. That's called sewing. Especially if you plan it should be, when you pull it, you want it to last as long as possible. So if you tighten it, or you have a loose button and you tighten it, or there's a loose hem and you pull in it to tighten it, that would be considered sewing on Shabbos. That wouldn't be allowed to be done on Shabbos. So you just have to leave it, and then hope it doesn't fall off until after Shabbos. But again, that would be more of a permanent level of sewing. Or if your temporary sewing is forbidden, that's for sure temporary sewing, which would be forbidden. So you have to be, such things you have to be careful with. But
is heat sealing considered permanent sewing?
Heat sealing is not. It's a form of tefer, yeah.
Because I heard you can open potato chip bags or yogurt lids because they're heat sealed and they're not glue sealed.
As we discussed in the past, no, you're not allowed to open up the potato chips bag. That's kriya, tearing, in a way that you're not destroying the bag, and that wouldn't be allowed. Okay, but anyway, let's get back to this. So now there's a question. I'll give you an example. What? That is not sewing. That's a kesher. If you have on your tzitzis, okay, while we're on the topic, You know, a lot of times you check your tzitzis before, you tell us before you put it on, or you tell us cut, you're supposed to check before you put it on, make sure that it's not ripped or anything like that. So a lot of times, the last knot of each tzitzit is a double knot, right? Now a lot of times it loosens up, as everybody knows, a lot of times it loosens up. So now on Shabbos, you're checking your tzitzis and you see that the second knot is loosened up. So now you want to tighten it, or you think you just even don't realize, you just tighten the knot, right? Now you just created a double knot, and the purpose of that tightening is that it should last forever. I mean, you don't want it to be open again. So that wouldn't be allowed to do on Shabbos. Now what you could do is, let's say the knot is an inch off, you know, it's loose an inch off. You could tighten it, but not all the way to the bottom. You could tighten it like 3/4 of the way, because then you're not making a knot. But once you make a double knot, you can do it. By the way, just in passing, if you want the knots not to open up too much, is when you tighten it tight, you put a little water on it, and then tighten it. So then it holds much longer than if you don't put water on it. Just to drop a few drops of water to make it wet, and then when you double knot it, it stays longer. It has nothing to do with Shabbos. Shabbos, you wouldn't be allowed to put the water on, because then you're cleaning the garment.
So the second knot is already there, you cannot tighten it?
You're making a knot, a tight knot, that's double knot.
If it's already there, you can't tighten it?
No. Because now you're making a knot. The knot loosened. So it's not a knot anymore. By tightening it, you're making the second knot. So that you wouldn't be allowed to do. But that's all in tying. Okay. To give you an example, there's a big machlekes in halacha about using safety pins on Shabbos. Are you allowed to use a safety pin? Now, is a safety pin called sewing or not? Okay? So according to all opinions, it's a big machlekes in halacha. So, if you have, anybody have safety pin on them? If you, no safety pin here? See, no safety pin. Anyway, so what happens, I take the safety pin, here's 2 pieces that are loose, right? So I stick the safety pin in 1 hole per side. Okay, and then tighten it, then close the safety pin. That everybody says you're allowed to. But if I go in and out in each side, that really what holds it, right? Because if you just put the safety pin for homework, everybody should go home, take 2 pieces of cloth, take a safety pin and do it, you report the results tomorrow, okay? That's the class homework. But if you put in one side each, then it's really not holding, because you didn't, but when you go in and out, so then it's really, according to many opinions, it's sewing. Unofficially in our circles, we're more makel about it, based on something that's not for now. But in a time of need, a person could do it. But it says in halacha, they should make sure to undo the safety pin within 24 hours. Because then it's not even called a permanent tying, it's not a permanent sewing, because you're planning to take it out within 24 hours. So it's not a permanent like this. When you safety pin things, technically it could last for a long time. So then you have to take it away. What?
The button is loose, can you pull it off?
What?
The button is loose, can you just pull it off?
No, you're not allowed to pull it off.
Is it
Well,
considered carrying then?
oh, so there's we'll see later. We're not there now. If you're allowed to walk out with a loose button on Shabbos, what?
On Yom Kippur, can you tie your shoes?
Yeah, same as Shabbat. Yom Kippur and Shabbos have the same dinim, except Shabbos, if you do it intentionally and you're warned, you get stoned. Yom Kippur, if you do it, even if you get warned, it's only kares. Hashem, 1 second. Hashem, you die early. Which the difference is, on kares you could do tshuva, and on skila you can't. I mean, nowadays you could, because we don't have skila. So, Yom Kippur and Shabbos is the same din. What?
If you have a button that's loose, and you take the cord just around it.
You're not allowed to. That's called sewing. That's what we just said.
No, but I'm saying it's loose. The cord is loose.
But the cord, the thread around it is tightening it. It's like pulling it, that you're tightening it, then you can't do it. Now you have a lot of interesting things. What happens, to staple two pieces of paper together is teifer, is sewing. You're sewing two pieces of paper together. Now a paper clip is not sewing because you just, not stuck together. You just fastening them together. It's not called in any way sewing. But a staple would be sewing. You have another issue also. Sewing applies also to the human body. So let's say sometimes a person has a cut, a big deep cut, right? So a lot of times you go for stitches. Okay, so sometimes on Shabbos you'd be allowed to go for stitches because it could be, if it's bleeding, it could be life endangering, you would be allowed to go to get stitches. But, they have now these Band-Aids, that's called a butterfly, what's it called, butterfly stitch Band-Aid. It actually, when you put it on, it actually closes the two pieces of skin together. That would be sewing on Shabbos. I'm not talking if it's a life and death. We're talking about a little cut. That would be or he calls it butterfly,
Regular Band-Aid also.
No, we'll see a regular Band-Aid is not allowed.
It's not allowed?
It is allowed because it's temporary, but in other words, you could. Okay, I'll tell you what the difference. Okay, let's talk about Band-Aids while we're on the topic. Let's say I want to put a Band-Aid on Shabbos. If I put it on the skin, you have Band-Aids? No Band-Aids. Okay, we're not doing.
That's how you do it, how you put it on.
Okay, so 1 second. This is it's not going to work.
Use a tissue or
No. Okay. There's it's okay. Normally, you put on a Band-Aid. Let's say I have a cut here, right? So normally, the way you put on a Band-Aid is you put it on and you wrap it over itself, over the tape over the tape. That is not allowed on Shabbos because that's made to last. That's made to last, and therefore it's a form of sewing. Gluing is sewing. Gluing two things together is sewing, right? So if you want to put on a Band-Aid on Shabbos, you have also the issue with the wrapper. When you open the wrapper, you have to make sure you don't tear it with paper, with letters, and all that stuff that we learned already. So the way you put on a Band-Aid is either, let's say I have a cut here, so I have to put on the Band-Aid like this. That I don't,
That's totally ineffective.
you have to put, I'm not saying if it's effective or not. I'm just saying you're not allowed to wrap it over itself, but I'll tell you what you could do. Either put it like this over the skin. That's for sure allowed. Why? Because that's not made to last at all. Or you can wrap it, but instead of wrapping the glue part over the glue part, you wrap one part over the finger and one, so you're not wrapping the,
Spiral.
You do a spiral. You don't wrap the piece over the other piece, the glue over the, so then again, you're only gluing it to your skin. Gluing it to the skin is not a problem according to halacha.
Why?
Because it's definitely not made to last. What?
So why wouldn't the butterfly thing be a temporary sewing?
Because it's not made, first of all, we learned many opinions say even temporary is forbidden. But it's also, when you put on a Band-Aid, you don't mean, you're not intending to leave it on, you're intending to leave it on for longer, as long as it would last. So if you hold it, if you have in mind that you're going to take it off right after Shabbos, and then we put on another one, which might be another issue. So,
Those butterfly things don't last very long. They'll last 12, 13 hours, maybe even another one.
if it's not going to last a day, then you could. But here they seem to imply it does last for a while. That's what they say. Yeah. And to be forbidden to close a wound, stitches, a butterfly, or steri-strip bandage. It said if in case of need, you'll be allowed to. So there are poskim that hold if you intend to take it out earlier, less than 24 hours, you'll be allowed to do it.